My notes.
You don't need notes.
Well, yeah, I do. The older I get, the more I need them.
I always forget to look at mine.
forget to bring them. That's my trick. My wife Suzette is with me right there. We own and operate Blue Ridge Honey Company. I'll give you about a 60-second bio type of thing, and then we'll move on to the subject matter. We started in Oregon. Some of you know that. In 1981, I went to work for a commercial beekeeper. Worked for him for several years. We ran the West Coast pollination circuit, almonds in California, cherries and pears in Southern Oregon, and then on to Washington State for apple pollination, and then on to North Dakota for honey. I moved to Georgia in 1991, and it's kind of a different scene here. It's more about selling bees and producing honey. Sourwood is a big reason that I'm successful where I am. Lakemont is Rabun County, the most northeasterly county in the state, also the rainiest county in the state and the second rainiest county in the whole country. My neighbor Jack keeps very close tabs on rain. He has a very nice rain gauge, official type, and he lives right next door to me, and he said we clocked 124 inches of rain this year. You believe that? Yeah, Germany Mountain area, which is north of me, clocked in at about 117, I believe. Crazy rain. We do have our facility is on 441, just north of Tallulah Falls. From here, it's about an hour and a half. If you're traveling up through Clayton-Dillard area, we're 5 miles north of Tallulah Falls on the left. We have a nice retail facility. You can view into the processing rooms, and we sell beekeeping supplies and honey, of course. We usually have anywhere from 6 to 10 varieties of honey. We don't sell just our honey. We produce a lot of honey, of course, but we buy honey from a lot of friends that I know and trust. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've had bees in California, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Florida, Georgia, of course, and North Carolina. This is the first year that I'm not going south, or I should say our bees are not going south for the winter. We used to go to South Georgia for the winter and try to get nukes and packages started early. And I'm just getting so tired of motels and wearing out the trucks and wearing out the crew, and everybody's just getting real tired of it. So Jennifer Berry just today was helping me find some yards over by Danielsville, over in your neck of the woods, I guess, and looked pretty good, actually. We found a few good spots, friends of hers. And then we have a lot of bees in Carnesville for the winter, and of course we'll have some up in the mountains. And all of that stuff will go back home for sourwood, of course. Sourwood's valuable honey. I'm sure most of you have heard of it or know of it. I think in terms of what it's worth in a drum, and right now I buy wholesale by the truckload wildflower type of honey or clover or whatever for around $2.25 a pound. Well, sourwood would be worth $5 or $6 a pound in a drum, and in a jar, of course, it's whatever the traffic will bear. So that's a lot of why we're where we're at. We didn't make any this year, or very, very little. It was a terrible year. It rained through May and June so badly that the blooms did not set properly. It wasn't. Usually, it's a problem of too much rain in July, but this time it was too much rain in May and June. You know, sunshine's part of the chemistry. You know, you got to have sunshine to make good flowers, and we just didn't have it in May when we should have. I'm going to speak on honey tonight. I know some of you, the new beekeepers, you're probably here to learn more about bees, and I apologize for that. But if you're successful, you're going to need to know more about honey. There's a lot going on with honey that people don't understand, don't think about. And really what I want to talk about is what happens to the quality of honey in the way we process it and the way we store it. Honey is very unique. With all the diet fads and different ideas on diet going around today, it's quite often that honey is simply referred to as another sugar, and that's just not the case. Honey has been found to have over 180 substances in it. Some of those substances allow our body to process it differently than other carbohydrates. Honey's been studied scientifically and medically many, many times. It's been found to be highly antibacterial, antifungal, lots of things. And how good it is for us doesn't just depend on how we use it, it depends on how we process it and store it. It's delicate. You can ruin honey in your processing, or I should say ruin those unique qualities that honey has in processing. With your permission, we've got a few YouTube videos out. I got this wild idea that I was watching a YouTube video one night, and I was watching the guy, and I thought, I could do that. And so I've learned through YouTube tutorials online and everything how to kind of do it. And if this turns out good, we're going to put it on as a YouTube video. If it doesn't turn out good, you'll never see it. So that's as simple as that. The channel, by the way, is just Bob Binney at Blue Ridge Honey Company. That's our YouTube channel. We've got 3 up so far, and I think by summer we should have 12 or 15 videos up on different things. They'll be interesting. It's not sophisticated stuff. We're definitely not professional video makers. It's all going to be nuts and bolts types of stuff. We're going to talk about what we do, why we do it, and how it works. And I'm going to parallel an article that I wrote about a year ago for Bee Culture Magazine. And if you Google the title, it comes right up. It's simply called Processing Honey, A Closer Look, Bee Culture Magazine. And I'm literally going to use the article as my notes tonight, just kind of keep me on track, keep me on subject. The first thing I'm going to talk about is temperature and how temperature affects honey. For better or worse, heat is used a lot in honey processing. Even if you're just processing a few buckets, most people use at least a little bit of heat to make it flow so you can bottle it. Many people like to bottle it hot so it won't crystallize. But what you have to keep in mind is the effect that temperature has on flavor, aroma, color, all of these things. And also the unique health benefits of honey. Honey has some unique enzymes in it. And there's 3 that come to mind. The first one would be invertase, glucose oxidase, and diastase. I'm kind of familiar with those. Invertase, it inverts sucrose to fructose and glucose. And the reason, and by the way, most, if not all, of the enzymes in honey are introduced by the bees. Keep that in mind too as we go through this. The invertase converts sucrose into fructose and glucose, and the reason that is being done is because those you can get more solids into your honey with those 2 sugars rather than sucrose. In other words, the bees are able to make it thicker, which contributes to its ability to not ferment and not spoil. And glucose oxidase is a pretty interesting enzyme. It produces gluconic acid, and in so doing, it brings the pH of honey down to approximately 3.9, give or take a point. That's really acidic. I mean, that's down there. That acidity contributes to its antibacterial properties. And during the process of doing that, it helps produce hydrogen peroxide. I probably don't need to tell you what hydrogen peroxide is good for. Highly antifungal, lots of stuff. And something really unique happens with honey. When you get down to about that 3.9 point, it stops producing hydrogen peroxide. But here's something magic that happens. If you put it on your skin, okay, like on a burn or a wound or a cut, when the salinity from your body mixes with the honey, the pH starts to rise again, and it starts to produce hydrogen peroxide all over again. I don't know how you'd produce that in the laboratory. You may be able to. I'm not a chemist, but just think about what that means for a wound. Think about that. The next one is diastase. Diastase converts starch into sugar, and that's the one I'm actually most familiar with the temperatures and what ruins it. For some reason, the math sticks in my head. Probably because years ago, well, not too long ago, but before this brand new technology, a lot of importers and packers used the activity of diastase to measure whether the honey had been exposed to a lot of heat or not. Does everybody know what half-life means? What would be the half-life means the the duration of time it takes to lose half of the activity at a given temperature, the activity of an enzyme or whatever it is you're measuring. When diastase is continuously exposed to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the half-life is 1,000 days. That's not bad. Which means even at 68 degrees, eventually you're going to kill that enzyme. Might take 2,000 days, but it's going to happen. If you raise your temperature to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, the half-life becomes 2 weeks. If you raise the temperature of your honey to 170 degrees, the half-life is 30 seconds. Okay? So what are you doing when you heat your honey up to 140 or 50 degrees to bottle it? All of these enzymes are acting similarly to diastase. All of them are being killed when you expose them to heat. Now, a lot of people, purists, and that's okay, I can be a purist myself, will say that if you're using any heat at all on your honey, you can no longer call it raw. But if you analyze that idea closely, I'm not sure it works because, you know, a colony of bees keeps the brood nest in the mid-90s, right? And the top super on a good hot summer day, I don't know, 110 maybe. So you're going to have an argument with Mother Nature if you're talking about heat, raw, all of that stuff. I just submit that if you just use heat very moderately and be careful, that I think you can still call your product raw. You just got to be careful with it. Obviously, sometimes you need a little heat. If it's crystallized and you got to liquefy it, what do? You just got to be careful with it. Oh, I have one here. Enzymes are really important. I think as we go on year after year, they're learning, you know, science is learning just how important enzymes are for good health. Merriam-Webster defines enzymes as complex proteins produced by living cells that catalyze or increase the rate of biochemical reactions. What's that mean? I don't know how to put it in scientific terms, but to me it means energy. It's like, you know, it's kind of a simplistic explanation, but it's really energy. So enzymes are important. Keeping them alive is important. If honey does not have the enzyme activity intact, you can't call it raw. You may put raw on your label, but it's not raw. You have to have those live enzymes in order to, you know, honestly call it raw honey. Okay, flavor, aroma, and color. Heat affects all of those. Aroma and color are part of what defines the quality of honey. I mean, I think everybody would agree with that. Flavor, of course, but aroma. Not so much color. In the old days, 20, 30, 40 years ago, people were tuned into light honey was best, and now we know better than that, of course. I've always kind of known better. What gives honey a darker color is really its mineral content. So if you're looking at it from a health food point of view, you might tend to want to think that dark honey's better for you. So color, not so much, but flavor and aroma, yeah, that has a lot to do with what we consider the quality of honey. Color, if you freeze honey or keep it very cold, color doesn't change much. If you get it cold enough, it doesn't change at all. But something interesting happens, and this is kind of a shocker, but it's true. As you raise the temperature of your honey, the rate at which honey darkens, and it will darken, that's not a debate, okay? The rate at which honey darkens triples with every 10 degrees Fahrenheit that you raise the temperature of the honey. Now, of course, if you're coming off of 32 degrees, 10 degrees isn't going to have a lot of effect, but it's going to be 10 times what it was at 32 degrees. Now, by the time you get into the 70, 80, 90, 100 range, you know, you're having this compound effect, and it can darken pretty rapidly. Some honeys, are, oddly enough, are more susceptible to this than others. Orange blossom darkens quickly with age. Sourwood does. Some honeys don't, like Tupelo seems to be pretty stable. Clover's fairly stable, but they all darken with age. Now, they don't just darken with age, the aroma changes, okay? The flavor changes. There's a chemistry going on there that never stops. And it's all about temperature. When we have people come into the store and buy a 5-gallon bucket of honey and say, well, I'm buying this so I can get a good deal on honey, but it's going to take us a year to eat it. Well, what do we do, My recommendation is to pour it all into any kind of container, your used mayonnaise jar, used peanut butter jar, as long as it's clean, of course, although peanut butter and honey go together pretty good. And can be glass. It will not break. Put them in the freezer and take them out one at a time. Freezing is absolutely the best way to keep honey. And here's a curiosity to me. You've always heard, don't always believe what you read on the internet. I found, when I was researching this article, I wanted to see what other people were saying about some of this stuff. I ran across a whole bunch, and I don't mean one or two, I mean a bunch, of celebrated food experts that were proclaiming that putting honey in the refrigerator was bad for it. That's completely untrue. The colder you store honey, the less it will deteriorate, period. The warmer you store it, the more it deteriorates, the quicker it deteriorates. It's like somebody wrote it and then a whole bunch of other people just copied and pasted it. It was really interesting. Anyway, I'll get off of that soapbox. Yeah, I said that. Oh, here's an interesting little note. National Geographic, some of you know this, recently found some honey in a tomb in Egypt that was quite old, thousands of years old, and they said it was still edible and had not spoiled. Okay, well, time is part of this equation with honey deteriorating. Not spoiling means it hasn't fermented. Okay, so it is still edible, but it's not good food anymore. I wouldn't have considered that good food. I mean, good for them that it was still edible after thousands of years, but I would not be the one to want to eat it. Fresh is best. Oh yeah, here's a good thing to remember. Liquefying crystallized honey in a microwave kills all the enzymes. Don't use the microwave. Yes, sir. No, the activity, the question is, does freezing kill the enzymes? I have to remember to restate the questions. Absolutely not, but what's curious is that when you get to freezing temperatures, the activity comes to a screeching halt. But then when you raise the temperature up again, the activity becomes active again. But if you kill enzymes with heat, they never come back.
So what's the best way to do it?
Pardon me?
What's the best way to do it if you don't heat it up in the microwave?
This is going to sound real odd, but the dashboard on your car on a hot summer day. Okay, and I'm going to talk about crystallization and temperatures later, but I'll just say this really fast, that honey goes liquid between 104 and 100. If you can get it over 105, maybe 110, it's going to go liquid for you. Just don't keep it there very long. Remember that equation with the half-life and all that. You're having an effect, of course, but just try to be minimal with your heat. Well, the next one's good. I got this one memorized, materials in processing. Remember how acidic honey is. Because it's so acidic, it reacts with all metals to different degrees. It reacts with tin, steel, iron, copper, aluminum, even stainless steel. I mean, everything really. But what's funny is there's two exceptions to this, and that's silver and gold. The reaction is very minimal with those two metals, but because we're not going to make equipment out of silver or gold anytime soon, I recommend stainless steel as the next best choice. Oddly enough, honey does react with stainless steel also, but it's so minimal that it's really our best choice. Materials in bottling are often not thought of enough. My opinion is that glass is best, okay? But I also know we got 350 grocery stores that our honey is in, and when you put glass beside plastic, the plastic outsells the glass probably, 6, 8, 10 to 1. It's dramatic. And I get it. I mean, if I was a mother with 3 little children, I wouldn't I wouldn't buy a quart glass jar. I'd get the little squeezable honey bear. And I'll be real honest, that's what I take home, a 1 or 2 pound bottle so I can squeeze it, you know. But glass is best. Honey reacts with all plastics. That's why it's important to use only food grade plastic, both in bottling and processing. Like when you get a 5-gallon bucket from Lowe's, is that food grade? I don't know. I probably shouldn't say because I'm not sure.
Depends on the plastic.
Depends on the. That's correct. Yeah.
Number 2 can be food grade.
Well, I've actually got a little information on that. The very best plastic for bottling is TEREPHTHALATE. We know it as PET. That's PET short for that word. PET plastic has a number 1 on the bottom of the bottle. If anybody had a honey bear here, you'd see a number 1 in the triangle. And then the next one, HDPE, high density polyethylene, is number 2 in the triangle, and it's the next best one. That's the type of plastic you would see for milk jugs, food grade buckets, or the skeps. We sell a lot of skeps, the little opaque colored skeps. They're that also. Okay, moisture. That's a good one that people overlook big time. Honey is very sensitive to moisture. It is hygroscopic, which means it will absorb moisture from the environment if the humidity is beyond a certain point. It's also hydrophilic, which means if the humidity is below a certain point, it will lose moisture. There's an equation here. It's not just a set in stone thing. If you, for instance, if you continually expose open honey to 60% humidity, it will eventually level out or equalize with the environment at 18.3% moisture. Now, we as beekeepers understand that that's a fairly decent place to be. Most people think that it won't ferment at 18.3, and that's not always the case. And we're going to talk about that when we get to yeast here in a minute. If you continually expose honey to 50% humidity, it levels off at 15.9. I like 15.9. That's a good place to be. No honey will ferment at that level. When you have honey that's a little thicker like that, to me, it has more character. I think it's a higher quality product, I really do, than thin honey. Now here's the kicker, and people don't believe this, but if you continually expose honey to 80% humidity, it's going to level out at 33.1% water. I'm going to repeat that one. 33.1% water in your honey. If you don't pasteurize that honey, it will blow the lid off the jar. It will ferment so bad. If not, it'll bend the dome or it'll leak all over the place. I mean, it will seriously ferment at that level. So, what do we do with that information? If you are harvesting your honey, extracting your honey, storing your honey, and bottling your honey in a high humidity environment, you're adding water to your honey. You need to keep your honey house or wherever you're dealing with your product needs to be below, at the very maximum, 60% humidity. You should keep it below 50. We bring our honey supers into what we call a drying room, and we run 2 commercial dehumidifiers in there that never turn off once we get into extracting season. We have a drain in the floor, and we just set them both over the drain and just let them run 24/7. We pull our moisture down between 20 and 30% humidity, and with what I just told you, you would understand that we're pulling a serious amount of water out of our honey. We have fans in the ceiling. I guess, what is there, 8 of them, Tommy? You've all seen them. It's the orange construction site fan that you might buy at Home Depot or Ace Hardware. We have them pointing right down on the stacks of honey, wide open. When you walk in there, it's moving your hair around. And not only that, do we have the low humidity, but we have warm temperatures between 85 and 90 degrees. We try to keep the relative humidity very low and the temperature up. Something that's interesting about temperature, and the warmer the temperature is, the lower your relative humidity will be. If you lock the doors and seal them, and raise the temperature from, say, 70 degrees up to 90, the relative humidity will go down. The reason for that is that relative humidity represents the saturation of the air. Like if you got 60% humidity, that means the air is 60% saturated in comparison to 100% if it was completely saturated. When you raise the temperature, warm air can hold more moisture than cool air, so the relative humidity goes down. So even without a dehumidifier, if you raise the temperature, you will pull the humidity down. Use fans, you can pull a lot of moisture out of your honey. Now, contrary to popular belief, moisture will migrate through wax cappings. A lot of people don't believe that, but it's true because I proved it to myself over and over in our warming room, drying room, we call it. But what we do is we actually try to harvest our honey. We do exactly what the books tell you not to do, which with us you'll see that over and over. Sorry. The books are a good start, but you know, there's an art to all of this, okay? And you'll learn that with time. It comes through experience. I like to say that beekeeping is 50% science and 50% art. And art really means, art is the skill that comes with experience. Okay? Does that make sense to you? And I'm sorry to tell you this, sorry to break the news to you guys, but art comes with trial and error, which means you're going to make some mistakes. That's how you get the art part of beekeeping. Where was I? What was I talking about before art? Relative humidity. Oh yeah, cappings on the comb. The books will tell you to get your comb capped before you bring it in, and that's because the bees are wise enough to pull the moisture down theoretically below 18.6 before they cap it. We like to bring it in when it's maybe 20, 25% on capped, put it in this warming room with this really dry, warm air and the fans, and that portion of on-capped honey in just 2 or 3 days will drop way down, 12, 13% humidity, or 12, 13% water in the honey. And then when we extract, all of this blends together and we'll end up with something that's 16 or 17%. I really like 16 to 17% honey. Can't always achieve it, but I really like it there. Hygrometer measures the humidity in the air. The ones you buy down at Home Depot and Ace Hardware aren't always real accurate. If you're really trying to work on this humidity thing, get you a good one. Spend 40 or 50 bucks. Some of the electronic ones work pretty good. I use a mechanical one that costs us like $80 or $90, and it's right on the money. I want to know what that humidity is in that room. Now this dehumidifier thing, you can do that. You don't need a big room to do this. If you've just got 2 colonies, you can put it in a closet and stick that thing in there with them. And at Walmart, you can get an inexpensive dehumidifier in your garage. Put up some plastic, create a little room, anything. I just highly recommend trying to dry your honey a little bit before you extract it. Honeybees keep the brood nest between 50 and 60% for a really good reason. I'll tell a funny little story. My wife and I were at a family reunion in Riverside, California. Was that 2 years ago? And it was hot. It was October, wasn't it? And it was still 101. I mean, it was hot. You're on the edge of the Mojave Desert in Riverside, California. And on somebody that had lived in California all their life and not knowingly said, "Whew, man, it's humid." I knew better than that. I said, "This is not humidity." So I got out my phone, and it was 7% humidity. It was hot, but it wasn't humid. And when we moved to Georgia in 1991, when we first got off the plane in Atlanta, I said, "Okay, that's humidity." Now I know. Also, this is an interesting fact that a lot of people don't understand. Honey has a really poor diffusion rate. If you try to dry your honey out after you've extracted it, you're going to have a very difficult time. I learned this the hard way years ago. I'd maybe set a barrel of honey out that I knew was too thin and warm it up and blow a real stiff breeze across it with a commercial fan or something and leave it there for weeks and come come back and just find that the top quarter inch has dried out, but the rest of the drum has not, that effect doesn't migrate very far with honey, very poor diffusion rate. What that means is that you're really best to try to pull your moisture out before you extract when you have this larger surface area. Now, if you have a commercial honey dryer, basically what they're doing is they're stirring the honey slowly and constantly and running this dry air across it, so they're always changing the surface. You can achieve good effects by doing that. Yeast and fermentation, yeah, not very well understood. Like I said earlier, a lot of books will tell you that 18.6 is the magic number. It's not. It has to do, it's an equation. It's an equation with the moisture and the yeast spore count in the honey. Yeast spores are usually measured by how many there are in a gram. Honey that has, say, just one spore per gram, you can get it up to 19% moisture, maybe even more before it'll ferment. 10 spores per gram, your magic number is about 18.6. Just need to stay below that. There are a number of honeys in this country that'll fall in the 500,000 grams per, or spores per gram. I purchased some cabbage palm honey out of Florida this year, and the guy sent me a sample, and it was great. And I got the honey in the drums a month later, and it was fermenting, and it was 17.5% moisture. So what that tells me is that cabbage palm is extremely high in yeast. So what do you do with something like that? Yeast, just like everything else in honey, is very, what's the right word, sensitive to temperature. If you get really thin honey, you can kill the yeast with heat, or you can stop it with cold. If you're going to kill it with heat, there's kind of two equations here. If you hold your honey at 125 degrees Fahrenheit overnight for 8 hours, you will kill all the yeast in it. If you hold it at 145 degrees, the yeast will be dead in 30 minutes. And that's why a lot of large packers like to use heat. They use heat for many reasons, and that's one of them. If you, I think it's 170 degrees, I think it's only 30 seconds to kill all the yeast. Don't hold me to that one. I'm having a hard time remembering that number. Now, oddly enough, if you store your honey above 100 degrees, it probably won't ferment because yeast doesn't want to work at those high temperatures. But the problem with doing that, as we've learned earlier, is that over 100 degrees, your honey is deteriorating in a lot of other ways. So that's not recommended. But if you can keep your honey below 52 degrees, the yeast stops. But of course, once you bring it back above 52 degrees, the activity comes back. So, freeze it, refrigerate it. It won't ferment in the refrigerator. Just know that when you raise the temperature, it will. Now, the yeast in honey is unique. It's not the same kind of yeast that you would find in beer or bread or something like that. The yeast in honey is tolerant of the high sugar levels in honey. And oddly enough, it doesn't come in the nectar. It comes from the field. The bees bring it in freely by touching things. Yeast is everywhere. For instance, if you kill the yeast in honey and bottle it hot, it'll be safe. But the moment you take the lid off and leave it open on the counter, it's no longer safe because yeast is entering it again. Yeast is interesting stuff. Crystallization. Oh, that's a good one. Crystallization is a little bit misunderstood. Why does honey crystallize? Okay. There's 4 major sugars in honey. There's dextrose, which is not, sometimes people call dextrose glucose. That's not always I got to be careful here because I'm not a chemist, but dextrose is D-glucose. I know there's an L-glucose also. Okay, back to how many? Dextrose, fructose, sucrose, and maltose in honey. Honeys that are high in dextrose are the ones that crystallize. I used to think, until I read up on it, that honeys with no dextrose were the ones that didn't crystallize, and that's not the case. A honey that's considered very low in dextrose is 20% dextrose. Considered very high in dextrose is 40%. Any honey that has 25% or less dextrose in it generally won't crystallize. That would be Tupelo, sourwood, black sage from California. There may be others that I'm not familiar with. Honeys that crystallize very quickly are Tai out of South Georgia and North Florida, canola, which is rapeseed, and cotton crystallizes pretty quickly. That means those honeys are high in dextrose. I used to go after canola honey. For a few years, I'd chase after crops of canola and try to make canola honey. I kind of started leaving it alone. One year, I got a pretty good crop of canola honey. Had it in the supers, got it home, started the extraction process, and then walked away for 2 days over the weekend. When I came back on Monday, my sump tank, my pump, my pipes, everything was crystallized. 2 days. Okay? That was a mess. That was a mess. But oddly enough, though, if you heat it... Now, here's something I haven't figured out. I want to read up on this. If you bottle canola real hot, it won't crystallize for a long time. Heat does something to the sugar chemistry. I haven't quite figured that one out yet. I need to learn more about that. Honeys that have a lot of dextrose in them will crystallize hard, and I mean hard. We got some honey out of North Dakota this year that's alfalfa and clover. Alfalfa has a lot of dextrose in it. You can tap your knuckles on it, it's that hard. And then we have other barrels of honey that have come in crystallized, but you can stick your finger in them. That has to do with the amount of dextrose in the honey. The more dextrose, the harder it gets. Also, some of you might know that if you keep honey long enough, it seems to go liquid again, oddly enough. That's because some of the dextrose in the honey will invert to other sugars with age. It's kind of a curious thing to see. The honey darkens, of course, because it does take time. And it separates. It's kind of like the liquid goes to the top and the crystals go to the bottom. That's because the dextrose is changing to other sugars. Eventually, it can go liquid completely. I've seen jars go, they're 10 or 20 years old. My granddaddy put it in the pantry kind of stuff, and it's gone completely liquid again, and of course it's real dark. So crystallization's interesting.
What were the last two? We had dextrose, fructose.
Fructose, sucrose, maltose. Fructose, there's a lot of fructose in honey. Okay. Temperatures. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. The optimum temperature for crystallization is 57 degrees. Back to this refrigerator thing. People think if you put it in the refrigerator, it makes it crystallize. No, it's just not quite true. The optimum temperature, in other words, if you want it to crystallize fast, put it on 57 degrees, and that's where you'll get the best results. That's why a lot of people that make creamed, or what they call it spun or creamed honey, will try to get in that 55 to 60 degree range. That's where it will crystallize the quickest. And the more you go below or the more you go above that temperature, the less likely it is to crystallize. In other words, if you freeze honey, guess what? It doesn't crystallize at all, ever, period. If you raise it up to 90 or 100 degrees, never crystallizes. Remember, honey goes liquid between 100 and 104. If it's crystallized, even the hard stuff that you can wrap your knuckles on, at 85 degrees it will begin to go soft again. It won't go liquid, but it'll get soft where you can dig it out with a spoon or something like that. It's a curiosity with creamed honey. You have to be careful where you're selling this stuff, because if you put it in a produce stand that's along the side of the road on a summer day, that little tub of crystallized honey is going to get pretty soupy. It's best in a grocery store that's 65 degrees or something like that. Another reason for heating honey very warm is honey has, I call them seed crystals. I don't know if that's the word you'd find in a book. If you look at fresh honey under a microscope, you're going to see little things floating around that look like snowflakes. Those are actually crystals. And that's the beginning of crystallization. And another reason for warming your honey quite warm is to push it through a very tight microfilter, the type that you can't even see daylight through. Because even particles of dust can be a platform from which the crystallization process can begin. The crystals start to bind to anything, pieces of pollen, pieces of dust, pieces of beeswax, anything. Filtration is considered a sin by some and absolutely necessary by others. I think we can all buy into that. If you're a big packer and you need long shelf life without crystallization, you're probably going to want to filter your honey extremely finely so you don't have any of those particles in there that can be the platform for crystallization. You also want it to look very nice on the shelf. Honey that's been very finely filtered, quite honestly, is just more attractive. Honey labeled U.S. Grade A Fancy, quote unquote, is free of defects that affect appearance and may not contain particles that affect clarity. In other words, if you can see it, you can't call it USDA or U.S. Grade A Fancy. This title is also very misleading because a lot of honey is sold in this country as U.S. Grade A Fancy that comes from all kinds of countries. That doesn't mean it was produced in the USA. U.S. Grade A Fancy doesn't mean it was made here. This label is not very well policed either. There's no U.S. Grade A Fancy honey police out there checking all the labels. So a lot of people, besides the word raw and the word natural, U.S. Grade A Fancy is very abused in the honey industry. But a lot of packers like to use that title because if you're a housewife and you're reading the label, that's going to give you more confidence in the product, naturally. But you've just taken all the good stuff out of it, which would be particles of beeswax, particles of pollen. You might have a particle of a bee foot too in there, I don't know. But you know, the really good stuff is being removed when you put honey through a filter like that. So what do you do with that information? We, at our place, when we transfer honey from our warming room into our processing tanks, we run it through an 800 micron filter. The larger the number, the larger the hole. 800 microns, let's see, a micron is 1,000th of a millimeter. It's also, if you remember this, 0.00039 of an inch. It's pretty small. The human eye can really can't see anything below about 30 or 40 microns. A pollen particle generally will run between 10 and 50 microns. So at 800, you're letting a lot of stuff through. There's a lot of people that will argue this filtering point. You'll see honey on the grocery store shelf, and I'm not picking on anybody, forgive me if I sound like this. There's reasons for doing many things. But you'll see a lot of honey on the shelf called ultra raw or titles like that. And they say that any filtering at all means it's not raw honey. Well, maybe there's a degree of truth to that. But if you're packing honey to sell, there's something you've got to consider. You know, honey straight out of the extractor is great, and I think it's the best too. The problem is not all debris is created equal. A bee foot or particle of beeswax or a bee wing is one thing, but a splinter or a frame nail or a chunk of wire off a crimp wire foundation is quite another. Okay? So, so we put it through this coarse filter. The other thing you can do is honey's really heavy. I mean, it's almost 12 pounds to the gallon. If you put it in a tank and just leave it there overnight or a day, everything that's light, like splinters, dead bees, all that stuff floats to the top. Everything that's really heavy, like nails, dirt, just plain old dirt, gravel, grit, it goes straight to the bottom. Have your valve just even a 1/4 inch off the bottom of your tank, and you won't get that stuff. So you can settle your honey also. I'm going to read something straight from the paper here. It's what I ended this article on. I really believe it's true. I say in the article, finally, on a personal note, I admit that when it comes to processing honey, producing a good quality product can sometimes be challenging. There will be mistakes made and lessons learned the hard way. We all know that. You may have to compete with people that have no problem with mislabeling and misleading customers. Let your quality and your service speak for itself, and remember it can take years to earn a good reputation. It only takes a few seconds to lose it. Okay? That's it. Hope it was worth your time.